So welcome in. This is Monday Morning MotoGP. We are here live on TikTok every race Monday, meaning if there's a MotoGP race on Sunday, we are right here 10 a.m. Pacific time on TikTok live talking about all the headlines and good stuff that came from the weekend. And then we repost this over on another platform that I'm hesitant to say so they don't push out the live, right? Okay, it's YouTube. So we're live here on TikTok, 10 a.m. And then if you miss us here live, you can watch the full-length podcast back over on YouTube later on today. So welcome in. Thank you everyone who's joining live, and thank you everyone who is ultimately watching this over there. We have a lot to talk about. We have big news from Gresini Ducati, some big rumors from Gresini Ducati. Also, Uccio made some comments about the future of Fabio Di Giannantonio and the VR46 racing team, as well as breaking news in the Kazakhstan Grand Prix saga that's been going on and off all season long. We also are going to talk about track limits and tire pressure penalties and all the things that went on this weekend in Assen Grand Prix. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you haven't already, please, if you aren't, like, follow, share, mash all the buttons here on TikTok, and then go over to YouTube and subscribe as well so you get all the MotoGP goodness you can possibly imagine. So first of all, the thing I want to talk about first, it's kind of redundant, but first of all, I want to talk about Joe Roberts in Moto 2. Had a bit of a crash on Friday, broke a collarbone. We know he's in the middle of a championship fight, which being injured is never a good thing when you're trying to fight for a championship. There was talk in the paddock that he still wanted to race on Sunday, wanted to try to salvage some points. That did not happen. Assen is a pretty demanding track. So if you break a collarbone and then are trying to push as hard as you can, Assen's probably not the exact track you want to be really flinging the bike around. So Joe Roberts did not make the start on Sunday, lost some very, very valuable points in the championship to Sergio Garcia and Ayagura and Fernand Daguerre. But he is going to try to make the start next weekend in Germany. That is a big track. There's a lot of left-handers, and because the collarbone is on the right side that is broken, it's separated. I guess they said it's not displaced, but it did, it is a break. That they're hoping he can make the start and it not be the most painful place for him to make the return. And I think he just wants to gut it out and survive the German Grand Prix, get a few points, and then they're going to have a little bit of time to heal over the summer break, and he'll be back, hopefully fighting for the title after the break. So get well soon, Joe Roberts. Big blow, but if it had to come at a time, at least it came before the summer break, where he does have 3 weeks to heal after the upcoming Grand Prix. So hopefully it doesn't put too much of a dent into his championship run. But again, Joe, get well soon. Sending all the thoughts out to the American racing team and Joe and his family and friends. Hopefully he's back on the bike real soon and fighting for that title. Because we also know he's fighting for a spot in MotoGP with Trackhouse Racing, and now that a lot of seats are starting to kind of get solidified, like this is the time where you want to be putting up results on the track. You don't want to be sitting on the sideline. You don't want to miss a contract because of an untimely injury. So hopefully that's not the case for him. But the big news this morning is coming out of Gresini Ducati. A couple things kind of I noticed after the Grand Prix. Besides, Gresini is one of those teams that has been, they're the smallest team on the grid, but they managed to stay in the headlines for the last couple years. I mean, if we had Enea Bastianini kind of, really putting them on the map, winning races with them. He was leading the championship a couple years ago. He gets to jump over people like Jorge Martin, take the spot at the factory team. And then we have Marc Marquez making a very infamous lunge into the Gresini seat next to his brother Alex. So Gresini has done a pretty good job staying relevant in the MotoGP paddock, despite being the smallest team on the grid. And they made a little bit of a headline this morning by renewing Alex Marquez for the next 2 seasons. Now, I don't think it was a huge surprise. I think they really like Alex Marquez. They have to thank Alex a little bit for luring Marc over there, and I think that is worth quite a bit. The fact that they were able to score Marc Marquez for this season, and have their bike running near the front. And Alex honestly hasn't been too shabby on that bike. The only people who are really faster than him on the 2023 Ducati are his brother and Fabio Di Giannantonio. It feels like Alex is kind of holding his own. He's running in the top 6 consistently week in and week out, which I think for a team as small as Gresini, the independent Ducati team, I don't think they're hoping for much more than, top 10s and top 6s. I mean, these are teams that are, historically running dead last on the grid, but they're up at the front fighting for podiums. And it isn't just Marc Marquez. Like, if it was just Marc, you could say, oh, well, it's kind of a fluke. But, with Enea Bastianini, with Fabio Di Giannantonio, now with Marc Marquez, they're fighting for podiums over the last 3-4 years. So you have to kind of take your hats off to the job they're doing. And I think they understand what they have with Alex Marquez. They have a seasoned rider. Is that he the most talented rider on the grid? Is he the flashiest rider on the grid? Not really. But he is someone that is going to get you a few results, maybe pick up a sprint win, a podium here and there. We haven't seen podiums from here this year because, just because the 2024 Ducatis are very, very, very strong. But he's a solid rider. It makes all the sense in the world they want to retain him. And I do think they like him over there. I think the atmosphere in that garage, if you just look, judging from their social media accounts, you have to say that they're having a good time over in Gresini. Marc is having fun on the bike. Alex is having fun on the bike. They're enjoying riding together. It would make total sense that they want to keep that, even though they are losing Marc. They want to also keep some consistency. I don't think every team wants to do kind of what Gas and what Aprilia is doing by basically replacing the entire lineup. I don't even think Aprilia thought, ideally, we'd like to replace our entire lineup at the factory team. A lot of these teams would love a little bit of consistency inside the garage to make sure that they're not just going from kind of front runners or even mid-pack to the back of the pack by just bringing in entirely new people. But it does beg the question of who's going to be next to Alex Marquez, because there is a young Moto2 rider who has a Ducati contract and doesn't have an exact seat. Everyone assumed Fermin Aldeguer would just be slotted into the Gresini, to the Pramac seat, get that new 2025 GP25, and take Jorge Martin's spot, and then the rest is history. With Pramac going to Yamaha, that isn't the case. He's got a Ducati contract. He's not going to Pramac Yamaha. So where is Fermin going to fit in? It's not the factory team, right? So either we're looking at Gresini, slotting him in there, or they're looking at VR46. It's kind of the two slots. And the Gresini seat makes a lot of sense if you look at Ducati and their infrastructure going, all right, we have Fermin Aldeguer, we have at the factory, we have Pecco Bagnaia, we have Marc Marquez, we have... Right now, we've lost Bezzecchi. We have not signed Digia. We have just signed Alex Marquez. Where does Fermin fit in? And I think him slotting in next to Alex Marquez makes the most sense, because Alex is kind of the more steady hand, if you will. You get now, like I just said, we have a little bit of consistency in the garage. Now you have a young rider coming in. What better crew chief to give a young rider than Frankie Carcetti? We saw what he did with Fabio Di Giannantonio. We saw him take Fabio from a guy who wasn't quite figuring out to a guy who was winning races, who was being on the podium, was running at the front. So you have Alex Marquez on one side of the garage, and you have Frankie Carcetti on the other side of the garage. They can really take care of a young rider like Fermin Aldeguer. So I think for me that makes the most sense. Not saying the VR46 isn't an option. It just feels a little less likely. And then we have to ask ourselves, because these GP25s are not going to Pramac, are they going to be split between VR46 and Gresini? Does Gresini get 2 GP25s? And I think at this point, the prevailing wisdom is that each would get one bike. I don't think either one of those teams has the kind of budget where they can afford to run 2 GP25s next season. So it feels like one may go to VR46 and the other may go to Gresini. And in that case, maybe you do give the new bike to the youngster. Like you've given up Pramac Ducati, you now need that new kind of feeder team to give you, the pipeline into the factory squad. Marc Marquez isn't on a 50-year contract. It's a 2-year contract. Pecco Bagnaia on a 2-year contract. So bringing Fermin Aldeguer in there, give him a GTP 25, getting him up to speed. The new regulations take over. No telling where the world is going to be in 2 or 4 years. So it makes a lot of sense to me that you would keep Alex Marquez as a steady hand. You keep Frankie Carcetti as a crew chief. He's a crew chief for Ducati. We know now, other breaking news, we know he's not moving with Marc Marquez to the factory squad. He is contracted with Gresini and not with Ducati directly, factory. So he is going to be staying in that Gresini team. And someone like Fermin Aldeguer would benefit greatly from someone like Frankie Carcetti, who, if you aren't following that guy on Twitter, you should be following him if you're into MotoGP and you're kind of a nerd like me. He always offers really good insight, technical information. He answers questions. He responds to comments. Really good dude, seems like, and he really knows his stuff. And it's just obvious from the get-go. Now, the weirder news coming out of the Gresini camp is that Formula One superstar, living legend, current driver Lewis Hamilton seems to be in the market for a MotoGP team. We know Lewis is super into motorcycles. He did that Rossi F1 MotoGP switch a few years back where he got to ride Rossi's bike and Rossi got to drive his Formula One car. We know he's a huge motorcycle fan. He has a motorcycle collection. Well, now the news is hitting that he wants to be a motorcycle team owner, and Gresini Ducati is possibly up for sale. And so Lewis is actually looking to not only move to Ferrari and Formula One, but also looking to be a MotoGP team owner. Now, this makes a lot of sense in a variety of ways. You have Lewis being ingrained in Formula One culture and also Liberty Media taking over MotoGP, also owning Formula One. Why not leverage your biggest superstar in Formula One as a team owner in MotoGP and help grow the sport that way? Will he bring in hordes of Formula One fans? Maybe. I don't think they can count on that as their single growth strategy, but it's not a dumb idea. It's not a dumb idea to have one of your more charismatic and polarizing even figures in Formula One be a presence in the MotoGP paddock. Now, he's still racing in Formula One. He's not going to be in the garage week in and week out, but having his name on that team, having him associate himself with that team, I think brings them some legitimacy. It brings them some star power that they're going to be losing when Marc Marquez is leaving. And it makes a ton of sense. And I think you have to look at how that team was structured. Nadia was not going to be the team principal and the brains behind that team. You know, it was supposed to be Fausto Gresini's team, and when he passed away, everyone had to kind of step up. And it does feel like they put an amazing Band-Aid across the top of this structure. Like, the team is well run. They were able to get Marc Marquez. They compete for podiums. They're always there. It seems like a well-oiled machine. It seems like a good place to ride. It seems like everyone who's gone in there is very happy there. I mean, Enea Bastianini couldn't say enough good things when he left. If you saw the MotoGP podcast this week, Fabio Di Giannantonio said, you know, he wasn't even going to go there, and him and Fausto had kind of history, and then it was all nothing but love when he got there in MotoGP, and he appreciated his time there more than anything, and it was bummed it came to an end. And Marc Marquez, I think, is saying the same thing. He loves being over there. He's having a great time with his brother. Alex loves it. And so it's a pretty decent team from top to bottom, but I don't think the management structure they have right now was meant to be long-term. So it makes sense to me that they've kept this dream of Fausto's running, and now someone like Lewis coming in and taking over ownership would take a lot of pressure off some of the players that maybe were thrust into roles they weren't 100% comfortable with. I think it'd be great. Actually, I think Lewis Hamilton owning a MotoGP team would be really good for the sport. I think, love him or hate him, he knows motorsports. He's been around it his entire life. He's a world champion, a multi-time world champion. And just post-Formula One career, having that guy in the paddock being involved in motorcycle racing, I think is good for the sport. It shines a visibility in a really positive way. Having him at press conferences, having him doing trackside interviews, it's all a good thing. So I actually really hope that this is true. I hope it can actually move forward. I think it'll be interesting to see him in the MotoGP paddock instead of the Formula One paddock. But I would love to hear what other people are thinking about that. It is that was one piece of news I wasn't quite expecting. I know Lewis is big into motorcycles, and when you're at his point in the career, he's looking past the end of his Formula One career. And like Rossi, kind of the reverse, where he, motorcycles his entire career, but kind of when it got to the end, he even said, a year or two before he retired was, well, I want to dabble in 40 wheels. I want to try something other than motorcycle racing. I don't think Lewis is going to get on the bike, but being the team owner might afford you a fast lap here or two, in practice. Maybe maybe he'll get a wild card. No, probably not. I don't think they'll give him a wild card, but maybe, take the bike out on the weekend or something. The boss gets some perks. That's all I'm saying. But it's interesting. I mean, I think and I say we as in the sport of MotoGP, the one thing we're kind of missing is big media splash. It feels like the sport of MotoGP is fantastic. The racing's good. I really think the product is up there. I think it's a better product than Formula One, but they really lack in the media aspect and the big social media splashing. I mean, you see Formula One, the way that you can barely look at the motorsport side of the world without seeing headlines on and off the track. The Red Bull drama, the Christian Horner drama, Max Verstappen and Lando this weekend, and Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari. There's so many big brands and big names and big personalities in Formula One that we don't really have in MotoGP that are household names. And the more we can bring those over, I'm not saying that MotoGP has to become just ridiculous spectacle and that's it. We need the substance. We have the substance, but I do think the thing we're missing are the Valtteri Bottas, his social media page. I'm not even a big Formula One fan. Huge fan of Valtteri and his social media and the Sauber team, the way that they handle themselves online. It's entertaining. And we don't see that as much in MotoGP. We see a lot of VR46. I think the VR46 team is maybe the best social media team in the paddock. You see a lot of them on TikTok and on Twitter or X and on Instagram. But a lot of the teams are kind of non-existent when it comes to the visibility in the media to try to get the sport out there to people who aren't watching. And there is a little bit of a barrier for entry. People look at MotoGP and they go, I don't know anything about motorcycle racing. I'm not going to watch. Oh, I don't even know who any of the motorcycle racers are. I know Rossi, and in America, maybe you know Ken Schwantz or something like that, but you don't really know modern day MotoGP. And so people like Lewis Hamilton have a chance to come in and kind of push MotoGP forward in that spectrum outside the racing. Because I think we have it when it comes to the product on the track. It's exciting. It's even this weekend, which is a quote-unquote boring race, I do think there's a lot going on track. And we need more positive media push to try to help the series grow. And I think Lewis is the type of person that can really help out with that. So I would welcome. And Lewis, if you need someone to help sell this Gresini, if you need people to help sell MotoGP with you, I'm available, bro. Reach out. Come say hello. I can be bought. I am 100% for sale, and I will preach the MotoGP gospel and help everyone make lots and lots of money for here on and forever. So put that out in the ether. Lewis, I'm with you. I'm on your side, and I'm available. Let's go. Also, before we move on to the little more technical side, also some comments came out about Fabio Di Giannantonio from Uccio Salucci from VR46. He was kind of asked, what is the future of the VR46 team? And he was seemingly very forthwith in the information department. I was not expecting this type of quote coming out of him. We heard this weekend that Fabio Di Giannantonio has some interest. He said on the podcast that there are teams that are talking to him, that he is in talks to be on a bike next year that can win a world title. Now, that does not sound like a guy who's going to be riding a year-old spec machine in a small team in the smallest corners of the MotoGP universe. That sounds like a guy who is looking for the most current machinery, just like Marc Marquez was. And the fact that Marco Bezzecchi has left the Ducati garage, he's left the Ducati stable, the birdcage, he's flown the coop, opens some opportunities for some young guys like Digia, like Firmin Albuquerque, like whoever else. And so there is some factory machinery out there. So let's talk a little bit about what his options might be to ride real factory machinery that can fight for a title next year. We're not talking about him going to Honda and help develop a bike that may or may not win a title next year. He said, I'm looking for a bike that can compete for a title from the first race of next season. Now, to me, that seems like there's only really two choices available when you say those words. 2.5 choices available, let's say that, because he said race 1, not race 10. Halfway through the season, he said, I want to compete for a title starting race 1 next season. So the first and most obvious choice would be for him to get a GP25, the most latest spec Ducati. Obviously, he has history with Gresini, and he's currently at VR46, so having a GP25 in one of those teams, that seems like the most likely scenario for him to get on a bike that can compete for a world title. There's a weird outside chance that he could move over to Trackhouse Racing and get the most latest spec Aprilia. Now, I think that would be a little bit of a long shot just because Aprilia has brought in 2 brand new riders in Marco Bezzecchi and Jorge Martin into their team. And so bringing in another kind of young gun to put on another of the Aprilia 25 machine might be a little bit of a gamble, but that would be the other machine that kind of springs to mind if people are talking to Fabio saying, hey, we can win a title with you. Let's start it next year. And when I say 2.5 choices, there is a new Pramac Yamaha team that will have the latest spec Yamaha, and Yamaha is making strides. They brought a new engine. They have a lot of hope coming out of that garage. Do I think they can compete for a title from day one with the 2025 Yamaha? I don't think so. Maybe they can be up at the front, but there would be an adjustment period for Fabio Di Giannantonio if he was to go to Yamaha, get into that Pramac seat, get that latest spec machinery next to Quartararo and possibly Alex Rins. But could he compete from day one? That would be a tall order. So the surprising thing that Uccio said was, we really want to keep Fabio Di Giannantonio at VR46. We understand that a lot of other people want him. We're the ones that signed him. We're the ones that gave him the lifeline to MotoGP. We hope that is worth something in the short term and the long term to him. We want to keep him here. We want to win with him. And they think they can get one of those GP25s allocated to VR46, while the other one would probably go to Gresini. And they want to keep Fabio Di Giannantonio. Now, why that's a little bit surprising is we also have Franco Morbidelli out there in the universe, who's been part of the VR46 Academy for a very long time. He's the oldest OG when it comes to the VR46 guys in MotoGP, and the smart money says that now with Bezzecchi moving on, that Franco Morbidelli will take one of the openings at VR46 instead of moving on to World Superbike or somewhere else in the motorcycle world, that Frankie is going to be moving over to that team, back into the nest. So we have one VR46 rider, Marco Bezzecchi, flying the coop, and another one returning to the birdcage. And because he is on the latest spec machinery, you might think that he would be the one to get a GP25 if VR46 were to get it. But if you look at the results, you have to say right now, Di Giannantonio is doing more with the machinery he's been handed. He's on the year-old bike, and he's beating Frankie week in and week out. He's beating nearly every single rider who's on the GP23. The only rider that is beating him is Marc Marquez on that same machinery. Alex Marquez, nowhere near him. Week in and week out, it seems like Fabio is running at the front, fighting with Marc Marquez. Marco Bezzecchi has been nowhere this year in that GP23. Fabio has figured it out much, much quicker. And now we see him fighting for the podium this weekend. It was not a given that Viñales or Marc or anyone else, Bastianini, was going to get that podium. De Giannantonio was right there fighting with the best of them. So if you look at results on the track, it makes much more sense to take that GP25 and hand it to Fabio De Giannantonio and keep Franco Morbidelli on the bike he's on right now. They could literally take that bike from Pramac and drop it in the VR46 garage and have Frankie continue with that motorcycle. It's a good damn motorcycle. It ran the race 30 seconds faster this year than the 23 ran it last year. It's a really fast motorcycle. Will a GP25 make a similar leap forward? We don't know. It could not. So those bikes could be very, very even when all is said and done. We don't know what the difference will be. We do know that the difference between the 23 and the 24 seems like a decent amount. We see how much more of an advantage the 2024s have this season over the 2023. Look at the podium this weekend. Pecco Bagnaia, Jorge Martin, Enea Bastianini, all in the latest spec Ducati, all much faster than everyone else around them. So I think Fabio De Giannantonio, if you were to read the tea leaves right now, if VR46 can put the package together, put the package underneath him, that he's going to be able to get that GP25. Like he said, I want the latest spec machinery, I want to be able to fight for a title from the get-go. In that VR46 team where he seems to be very, very happy. He loves the atmosphere. He thinks the atmosphere is fun. He fits in. He's a lighthearted guy. I think, along with Marco Bezzecchi, De Giannantonio is one of those like bigger-than-life, bright personalities that MotoGP needs. He's the kind of guy that's fun in press conferences. He's great on the podcast. He's always good on camera. He's always got an amazing attitude. He's funny. He jokes around. He's got personality. He's one of those guys we need in the paddock. And what better place for him to be than at VR46 in that atmosphere that encourages that type of stuff. They want their riders to be happy and loose and relaxed and fast. And that could really happen if he's given the opportunity to keep one of those most recent spec Ducatis in that garage. I think he's the deserving party right now. I know Frankie has the seniority, but it's taken Frankie a little longer to get on terms. He's been dealing with injury. He's starting to get a little faster. But Digi's fighting for the podiums, and Frankie's fighting for top 10s. And so I think Frankie still has a lot more to prove that he belongs there. I think he probably will get slotted in next to De Giannantonio in that garage. I think he stays in MotoGP. He keeps trying to learn the Ducati. But why not keep him on the same machinery? Keep him on that 2024. Let him prove himself there. And may the best man win. See who has the form. Because again, these contracts are 1-2 years. They're not forever contracts. There's nothing that says Digi doesn't spend a couple years at VR46 with the GP25 and the results are great, and he even moves on to a factory ride somewhere else. Maybe he takes a factory Yamaha ride or a factory Honda ride or a factory Aprilia ride in 2 years, in 2027. The regs are changing. There's nothing guaranteed for any of these riders or any of these teams. And then at that point, if Frankie's still fast, you go, okay, Frankie, now you get the better bike, and we move some young kid in here, and we develop the young talent. But as of right now, it feels like the guy with the hot hand is Fabio De Giannantonio, and you need to get this kid a latest spec bike, because I think if he has that, he might be competing for wins on more weekends than he isn't. Okay, so let's talk about the big fat elephant in the room, and that's technical infringements. Oh, that's going to be an exciting topic to talk about technical infringements on a Monday morning, but it played a big role in the race on Sunday with Marc Marquez getting hit with the tire pressure penalty, the dreaded post-race tire pressure penalty, 16-second penalty, boots him back to what, P10 from fourth? And then we have Maverick Viñales exceeding track limits in that chicane, which happens so often. That's why the chicane is there, I think, is just for track limits. That they just like to give track limits penalties, so they put that chicane there to make sure that they could hit their quota. Because Assen is the place, if we don't remember, last season, Brad Binder exceeded track limits on the last lap of the race, I believe in the exact same place Maverick Viñales did on Sunday, and lost 2 podiums in 2 consecutive starts. And Maverick Viñales cost himself a 4th place or as a fifth place, cost himself a fifth place by hitting the track limits warning or track limits green paint on the last lap, forfeiting a spot and moving back. So there's a lot of talk on social media and in the media today about those track limits warnings and about the tire pressure penalty, because this is the first time we've seen the tire pressure penalty influence the course of a race. We've seen it be levied after the race. We haven't really seen it affect the track action the way it did this weekend, because Marc Marquez is a very, very smart racer. He's going to try to avoid things like penalties. So we saw him mid-race look down at his dash, realize that his front tire pressure was low. He waves De Giannantonio through and then follows behind him for a number of laps, trying to get the pressure up on that motorcycle so he wouldn't be penalized. And he said he had it under control. The pressure was where it needed to be. And then Bastianini made a pretty aggressive move on Marc. And when that move happened, it kind of split up the pack just enough where Marc was no longer running in a close group, and he was kind of running not on his own, but with enough clean air that that tire pressure dropped just enough to put him under the limit and get him that penalty for the end of the race. And it was a fine margin. I think they said 0.01 psi for one lap, which is unfortunate. So I think the bummer of this new tire pressure rule is the fact that it's now, we have guys trying to follow other guys, not to get a slipstream, not to be competitive and get fast, but just so they can get some hot air on the front tire and make sure they're within these limits and make sure that there is enough pressure in the front tire. So I think there's a lot of, rightfully so, some kind of head scratching going on in the kind of post-race analysis of like, is this the kind of series we want, where riders are jockeying for position behind each other to make sure that they're within the limits of, you know, where their tire pressure needs to be. But I think the thing that isn't talked about quite enough is the fact that these teams don't need to be running on this razor's edge quite as much as they're doing. Now, I know that each one of these teams is trying to use every single thing to their competitive advantage. You want to be doing the things that other teams aren't doing. You want to be smarter than the other teams. You want to be setting that tire pressure so close to optimal that you have better results than your neighbor. But with these razor thin, you know, okay, if we're going to be following someone, we can put 0.2 psi more. We can do this. We can kind of finagle it. Okay, well, if we're running at the front, this is how much tire pressure. We're doing all these mathematical calculations, but everything has to work out the way you kind of thought it did. And with Marc Marquez and Gresini, they thought he would be running in a group, starting from where he was in the group position, where he's in the second row. He's going to be running in a group for a while. He's going to be able to have dirty air on that tire. It'll come to temperature, and then it'll be optimal, and he won't have to be worrying about penalties, and then he can just go. He didn't expect to be kind of leading that group in third with the other two guys so far ahead that he couldn't keep up. But it is the teams that are deciding to live on this razor's edge, to live and die by this proverbial sword. They could give themselves a little more margin for error one way or another. They could put a little more air, risk the tire blowing up, risk losing a little front end feel for the chance that just to make sure we're going to be within that kind of bubble of being okay and not being penalized. They could give themselves a little more margin for error, but they would be losing performance, and they all want the most performance they can possibly get because MotoGP is so freaking close right now. They're looking for every advantage they can possibly get. But there's the rub. They're on the razor's edge. So any mistake in strategy, or the strategy not going exactly like you like it, starts to cause you problems. We saw the Yamaha for years with that front tire pressure issue. The last couple of years, every time they would get in a group, the tire would blow up because they were leaving themselves a little margin for error, because the Yamaha likes fresh track. It likes to run its lines in the corner. They were always hoping to kind of get to the front, be out front, and not have to follow anybody else. And when they did follow somebody else, they were in trouble. But that was the strategy they were using. But it was giving them a little bit more margin for error. So now when you deflate these tires to nothing and you're hoping they come up to temperature, you're dealing with 0.01 psi. That's how much you're off by. You're really flirting with disaster. And I think that's what's not being mentioned as much, as these teams are really, when it comes to these pressure penalties, flirting with disaster because they're trying to get the most performance and the most feeling for their riders. They don't want to go, oh, it's close enough. We know we'll be within the limits, but, we're going to lose a little bit of performance. No one wants to give up the performance. So they're going to ride on the ragged edge. And I think in the case of Gresini and Marc Marquez, they just got bit by it. And I don't know what exactly the solution is. Like, do we want to just say, screw the tire regulations, screw Michelin's idea of what's safe and what's not, and we're just going to go out there, do whatever the hell you want with the tires, and it'll be fine? Maybe they need to institute a penalty if the tire does come off. Then they could say, hey, you were under tire pressure and you had a malfunction and now you get a penalty. But if it doesn't, no harm, no foul. But you also don't want to be in a situation where the sport becomes unsafe for the rider and for the fans. A tire comes off because it's underinflated and goes flying into the crowd. Something stupid freak accident. You don't want to be sitting here a year from now going, well, yeah, we should probably put a rule in place that was already there, but we took it out because we didn't like penalties, but now we've killed someone. So I don't know exactly what people want to do. I think the teams need to have a little bit of responsibility for making sure they're within the limits. At the beginning of the season, they gave them a little wider berth. They made the acceptable range a little wider, and every single team said, hey, this seems fair. I think we can stick within these confines. And now we're seeing that's not true. You guys can't, because you're looking for that extra bit of performance. You're looking for that extra bit to squeeze out that the other guy isn't willing to do. That little puff of air. We'll just pull one more puff of air out because that'll give us more grip on the front end, more feeling for the rider. It'll make us faster. It'll get us podiums. It'll get us wins. And when you're operating with margins that thin every once in a while, it's going to bite you in the ass. And we saw that happen to Gresini Ducati this weekend. Now, Marc tried his best to manage it. I don't know if that will become a new trend to see riders trying to manage it like Marc did. But I do think it's on the teams a little bit to set themselves up correctly. If they're flirting with the limits too much, it's the limits. They don't have to flirt with the limit. Just like you driving the speed limit on the highway. You say, I was only going 75 and a 65. I wasn't going that fast, but you were going over the limit. Nobody says you have to go to the limit and beyond. And it feels like a lot of these teams, that's what they're doing. Some of them are getting away with it. Some of them aren't. And the fact that there were a lot of riders on Sunday that didn't get tire pressure warning, that didn't get tire pressure penalties. So you look at one team, and it's a prolific team with a prolific rider, and he gets a lot of headlines, and you can say, oh, this is such a bullshit rule, and it should never have been called that way, and it's just awful. You can say that, but there were 20 other guys that managed to get it right. So I don't think we can say the rule is really the problem at this point. But it did throw a little bit of wrinkle into the race and affected the race in a way that maybe a lot of people are right to say, well, I didn't like that look. I don't like riders having to jockey for position because they're worried about some technical infringement. I want to see racers race. But again, everything is part of the strategy. And when they strap on the helmet and they pull the throttle, they twist the wrist, they all know the rules. They all know what rules they're operating under. So it's the same for everybody. And like I said, 20 riders on Sunday were just fine. The other thing is the track limits warning, and I'm not going to harp on this too much because I think I've already talked about this on the podcast, but Assen is one of those tracks. It's fast, it's flowy, and when riders are pushing very, very hard in those fast and flowing corners, they tend to go off the track because, again, they're pushing to the absolute limit. And when you're pushing to the absolute limit and you make a small mistake, you go off the track just a little bit, just by millimeters, but millimeters is all it really takes to hit the green paint and to incur the wrath of the MotoGP stewards. So again, we can go back to it. I don't want to talk about it too long because we've talked about this many times already, but why does this rule exist first? And then why does everyone hate it second? So the rule exists first because in the old days, these green areas, these painted green areas, were either grass or gravel at the end of the track. You would have track, curb, then grass or gravel. And if you look at some of the tracks that Moto America run or British Superbike run, it's still that way. But MotoGP, they want this to be the pinnacle of motorsport. They want this to be a pinnacle of motorcycle racing. They want these guys to be racing really, really hard. And when you are racing this hard on machines this big, you come leaned over, you run wide out of one of these fast turns and you hit grass. It is a nasty, nasty crash. It is the type of crash that you don't walk away from sometimes, that you get severe injuries sometimes, and they're trying to eliminate those. So by pulling out the grass and the gravel and replacing it with tarmac or cement or whatever it is just off the track, they're basically looking at the riders going, we care about your safety. Because it's not safe to have you pushing this hard into these fast corners or into these chicanes, and your tire comes off the curb by 2 millimeters. You catch a little grass that's a little wet, you catch a little gravel, the rear spins up and it high sides you into oblivion, or you lose the front. It's not a good time for anybody. So they decide to make this tarmac, but to keep the riders from just using that, to use that safety feature to go even faster, there has to be a penalty because you touched that. Because if it was gravel or it was grass, you'd be getting more than a penalty. You'd probably be getting something broken. So that's the spirit of it, is, hey, you're running on a part of the track that isn't the track. If it was grass, if it was gravel, you'd be losing a whole heap of time. You might even be crashing. We want the riders to be safe, but we don't want the riders to use safety features to be faster. So that's where the track limits come from. Now, the argument online immediately is, oh, there was too many track infringements, there were too many track limits, this track limits thing is bogus, Maverick Viñales touched the green paint, he doesn't get a competitive advantage, and you're penalizing him. And I ask once again, why is MotoGP the only sport that the fans think there shouldn't be a boundary? The fans think there shouldn't be any penalty for going out of bounds. Name a sport where you can just go out of bounds and there isn't some in-game consequence. If soccer's your sport, you kick the ball out of bounds, whether or not it was a pass forward, or if you just accidentally just turned around and kicked it out of bounds and there was no competitive advantage gained, your team loses possession. There's no stipulation that says, oh, well, he was dribbling the ball up the sideline and it just got away from him. There was no competitive advantage for him to dribble the ball out of bounds, so he just gets to keep going. No, the ball goes out of bounds, the other team gets the ball. In the NFL, you step out of bounds. It doesn't matter if you're running down the sideline all alone and there's no competitive advantage for you to step out of bounds. If you're running down the sideline and you step on the boundary, the play is over. If you hit a ball in baseball outside the foul line, outside of what is fair, it doesn't count. It doesn't matter if it was an inch on the other side of the foul line or the foul pole. It's foul ball. It's just, there's a boundary. Sports have fields of play. The field of play for a motorcycle race is the track. The track limits are the boundary. So if you go out of bounds, there's consequences. And I think even the way that MotoGP handles it, they get chances, they get warnings, and then they get levied a penalty. So at that point, you've gone out of bounds more than one time. By the time they're levying a penalty, you've done it multiple times. With the exception of the last lap. That's kind of a, hey, don't screw up on the last lap. But again, everyone knows the game they're playing when they sign up for it. And Maverick was the first one to say, yeah, I hit the green, it's my bad, I deserve to lose the position. The fans are the one that can't handle it. But I ask again, and I would love anyone to come in, comment, and argue with me. I think people have tried on Reddit and Twitter and other places on the internet. Tell me why MotoGP shouldn't have a boundary like every other sport, and I will argue you into oblivion. There's no justification for the fact that the track is the boundary. Now, the last argument I heard was, yeah, well, I don't want the track to not have a boundary, like they have a curb, and if they go off the curb, there should be grass there. All right, so let's go back to the 90s, let's put the grass back in, and let's deal with the injuries. Let's deal with paralyzing riders. So you want to make the sport more dangerous rather than having people get penalties? That's a silly opinion in my personal viewpoint. Okay, so Kazakhstan is yet again in the headlines. The Kazakhstan Grand Prix, the troubled Kazakhstan Grand Prix that was taken off the calendar last year because it wasn't ready, was postponed, well, this year. And we were like, well, postponed to where? Because the calendar's pretty full. And then when the India Grand Prix kind of dropped out and they're saving face by putting it at the top of next season, or supposedly putting it at the top of next season, they said, oh, that's when the Kazakhstan Grand Prix is going to be. It's going to replace India on the calendar. And then we wake up Monday morning to yet more news that once again, the Kazakhstan Grand Prix is canceled. Now, there are some factors that are outside of an organizer's control. You know, with Argentina, they lost public funding. There wasn't really the infrastructure to bring it in there. Without that public funding, they have to cancel the Grand Prix. With India, obviously, there was problems with the promoter and the organizer there locally. They weren't paying their bills, supposedly, and they were saying, oh, we'll get it all straightened out, but Dorna kind of said, well, we're going to give you till next year to get it straightened out. But then it feels like there are issues where you're just begging to have problems. And I think one of the things, and I will say mistakes, that MotoGP is making with this Kazakhstan Grand Prix and the Indian Grand Prix and all these places that maybe aren't quite ready to host a Grand Prix. Either the infrastructure's not there, a reputable organizer isn't in place, the hotels, just the track's not ready, all these things. Shouldn't we have these ducks in a row before we plan to go there? Why are we planning on going to a racetrack that is like currently being built? And the organizers are come to you with a piece of paper going, here's what it's supposed to look like when it's done. And an organization like Dorna is like, okay, we'll put it on the MotoGP calendar. Based on a piece of paper, based on aerial photos and satellite imagery, we'll decide whether or not this is a good idea to do. And maybe they've done all this, but from what I've seen and what I've read, this race was never going to happen this year. It was very, very optimistic. And I just don't understand the urgency to make this happen before a place is ready for it. There are so many tracks we're not going to. We're not going to Brno. We're not going to Aragon and Jerez. I mean, I get it. We don't want to run 12 races in Spain, but there are a lot of places we could go with MotoGP that we're not going. And we're going to Kazakhstan. Okay. You could give another race to the UK, find a track in the UK, the infrastructure there, put 2 races there. There's tracks in Canada. There's tracks in Mexico City. Places that have infrastructure. But we're going to go to Kazakhstan before they're ready. I don't understand the urgency to expand the sport to a place that isn't ready to accept it. And it's the problem I have with the Olympics a lot of times. They choose cities that have no infrastructure and then go, okay, you have 4 years to build everything. And then are just shocked when there's human rights violations that go on in the building of the venues. Oh my gosh, they're using quote unquote slave labor to build these massive Olympic complexes in the 4 years we've given them? Yeah, of course they are, because they have to get it done. And you chose to do it in a city that has no business hosting it yet. You look at a place like Los Angeles that's going to host the Olympics. That's a city that doesn't have to build a freaking thing to host the Olympics. Nothing. Now that's the other end of the spectrum. Should that be a requirement to host the Olympics, that you have to have all the infrastructure already there? No. But I think you should have a hell of a lot more than nothing put together before we start going, you know what, that's where we should race. Just because Kazakhstan broke ground on a brand new facility, which is, by the way, supposedly in the middle of frickin' nowhere, doesn't mean you have the hotel structure, the transportation structure, the traffic management, the grandstanding, the entertainment infrastructure to host a Grand Prix. Why aren't we having a kind of bare minimum going, all right, you have to have XYZ in place, and we're going to get on a plane. And when we say we, the Dorna executives are going to get on a plane, fly there, and we're going to look at all the infrastructure you have in place. And it better be a lot. It better be quite a bit. And the stuff you don't have better be very easy to obtain. Why is that not going on? Instead, they're going over there going, oh yeah, the track seems like it might work. Oh yeah, in 6 months the track will be built. Well, the track's behind schedule. It's not going to be homologated. We can't go here this year. We'll go there next year. Well, flooding in the region. It's a small country. There's flooding. We don't want to put any stress on it. Okay. Now, even with the flooding, there's still no infrastructure there. 2 years, 2.5, 3 years we've been dealing with this nonsense. And we're still here with this Grand Prix that's never going to happen. What is the rush? Why can't they get their ducks in a row and then get a Grand Prix? It should be a bare minimum. There should be a minimum amount of readiness they're already at before someone at Dorna goes, okay, we can do a MotoGP race here. It's going to happen. We have full confidence that there is an organizer there that is reputable, that people aren't getting ripped off. People are buying tickets. They're going to expect to go to an event. They're going to spend their hard-earned money in that part of the world for an event that's going to take place, not for an event that's going to be perennially canceled. So I think it's a little bit irresponsible on Dorna's part. I think they got their eyes a little too big with the expansion of MotoGP into different parts of the world. I know they're very enamored with flying all over the planet. I love the flyaway races. I love the fact that we go to Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and Japan and Australia and all these places. It's amazing. It's my favorite part of the calendar. But those places have to be ready for the race. And even with the Indian Grand Prix, running it in the time of year they were running it, or it was 1,000,000 degrees and you have riders fainting in Parc Ferme. Like, let's put our thinking caps on and not just our money caps going, oh, where can we expand to? Of course the Indian fans deserve a Grand Prix. Let's do it intelligently. Of course the fans in Kazakhstan deserve to have a Grand Prix. I think where there are MotoGP fans, they should have a Grand Prix. I want more Grand Prix in America. I want another one. But I do think we can't just go back to Laguna Seca because it's there. Or we can't just go, hey, Laguna will spend $20 million in the off-season to get that track up to spec. Trust us. And then we'll show no progress for a year and go, oh, oops. We thought you were going to come here anyway, even though we didn't meet the deal. No. You're going to come here and you're going to look at the track and go, oh, this track is up to our standards. Are there hotels? Is there hospitality? Is there a town nearby? Can I grab a drink after the race as a fan? Is there a place to put the fan zone? Is it safe? You got to ask these questions. Why aren't we asking these questions? Why is this race canceled yet again? And how come basically everybody but Dorna knew it? Or is it that much worse that they did know it and just been playing around with everyone's emotions and pocketbooks? Because all the freelancers that are traveling with MotoGP now have to eat all the costs for not going to India, have to eat all the costs for not going to Kazakhstan, and we're replacing the Kazakhstan Grand Prix with another Qatar round? What? You're telling me there wasn't another track that was a nice backup? What about this infamous Hungary track? Aragon? Somewhere? We're going to Qatar again. That's the best use of our resources. I don't think so. All right, the last subject I want to touch on really, really briefly is something that Bo brought up in the chat at the very beginning, was this idea that the races this weekend were a bit boring. And I've said this before on the podcast, that if you find yourself watching a boring race, I would ask you to just look closer at the race, because even in the comment, what was said was it was a little bit of a boring race, but there was kind of a nice battle for third. And yeah, I agree. I think the battle for third place was one of the better battles of the season. We had 4 or 5 riders at one point. I mean, it was almost a group of 6 fighting for one position. And 2 of them are guys that you would expect to be competing for the world title when we talk about Bastianini and Marc Marquez. And then you have Maverick Viñales on that Aprilia. You have Fabio Di Giannantonio, who's been very fast. You have Pedro Acosta. You have Alex Marquez. There was a big group fighting for one spot. It was reminiscent of Moto3 at times. So there was a ton of stuff that happens. And I'm just going to rattle off the kind of things that went on this weekend to kind of counter this idea of what was a boring race. Because not every race is set up to be a barn burner. Not every race is going to be overtaking galore at the front. Not every race is Catalunya 2009. But guess what? Catalunya 2009 isn't even Catalunya 2009. Everyone wants to place that race as like the greatest example of the best of MotoGP. Well, outside of one of the best battles in MotoGP history between Lorenzo and Rossi, the next guy was 10 seconds behind that battle. Nowhere near in the picture. No one else mattered that day. No one. There's not a boring race where only 2 positions were fought for the entire time. Was it at the front? Absolutely. Was it 2 guys at the top of their game? Absolutely. Were they on the best motorcycle? Was it entertaining? One of my favorite races of all time. But even that race doesn't really live up to its own hype. Because behind them, nothing was going on. Who got third? Most people probably couldn't tell you. So the same thing with this race. A lot went on in this race. So we were like, oh, it's a really boring race. I don't think so. You had Pecco Bagnaia running an immaculate, consistent pace, world-class pace. No one could touch him. We have to be able to appreciate things like that. We have to be able to appreciate when someone is at the top of their game and being the best of the frickin' best. We appreciate it in other sports. You appreciate when a pitcher throws a no-hitter. Is it the most exciting game? No, there's no home runs. There's nothing going on. It sucks. It's a boring game unless you understand pitching. If you have 2 pitchers, both pitching a no-hitter in the same game, it's an incredible game. It's just not exciting in the way you'd expect it to be exciting. There's no runs being scored. Doesn't mean it's boring. It's just a different kind of game. The same goes on with defensive battles in soccer, a 0-0 match. I think Americans give soccer a bad rep. Oh, no scoring. Yeah, well, sometimes those 0-0 games are insane and highly competitive and highly physical and highly entertaining. But if all you're looking at is the scoreboard, I get it. You think it's boring. You're not looking close enough. So look closely at this race. Look at Pecco being on the absolute edge of perfection, untouchable. Look at Jorge Martin pushing as absolute hard as he can, and it wasn't good enough. 2 guys at the top of their game on the exact same bike, and one was just better than the other. And those guys were so far clear of everyone else. Now you have a 5-way battle for third place between guys on very similar machinery with Marc Marquez and Di Giannantonio. You have Maverick Viñales, who really desperately wants to be on the podium. You have Pedro Acosta, who wants to be on the podium, who's desperately trying to prove himself as a young rookie. You have Alex Rins launching himself to the moon in that first turn in a high side. You have Pedro Acosta crashing out of the race. You have Enea Bastianini coming from 11th on the grid to get on the podium. You have Marc Marquez intentionally dropping back behind Fabio Di Giannantonio to try to get air on that tire. You have another incident where Di Giannantonio and Marc Marquez are kind of jockeying for that position. Neither knows what the other's really doing into that chicane. Maverick Viñales splits them right down the middle. You have Pedro Acosta, I already said this, crashing out of the race. You have Bastianini's very, very aggressive move on Marc Marquez. You have action going on all over the track. They were 4 wide at one point in this race. And then it ends with 3 bikes within a tenth of a second of each other between Marquez, Viñales, and De Giannantonio all crossed the line within half a second of each other, and post-race penalties, and post-race infractions, and track limits. Is it the type of race like we saw in Austin this year? No, it's not that. But if you find yourself going, oh, it was a boring race, look deeper. Appreciate the perfection that Pecco and Jorge Martin, honestly, like, the show they put on by themselves was impressive. They deserve a little bit of a round of applause and not, oh, it's just so boring watching the leader disappear. The leader's disappearing because he's the best rider on the best bike. And he's starting from the front. What do you want to do? Start from the back? We could try that. Don't think it's going to work. So I'm going to keep flying this flag of, yes, some races aren't as exciting as others. But in every race, there's a lot to look at. And the most boring MotoGP race is preceded by a Moto2 race and a Moto3 race. So if you can't take something from a day at the races on Sunday, sometimes we even get Moto E. If they're giving you 4 races on a Sunday and you can't take something from that weekend, and all you're coming back with on Monday morning was, that was boring. You might not like motorsports. You might not like motorcycle racing. You might like the idea of it. You might like Catalonia 2009. Or you just might like to complain, which I think is probably the case, judging from most of the banter online. All right, y'all, that is the Monday Morning MotoGP podcast. Thank you so much for everyone who joined live here on TikTok. And if you didn't get a chance to join live here, we're going to repost this on YouTube for everyone to see. And you can watch old episodes of the podcast. You can watch different content we have up on our YouTube channel. So make sure you're going over there and subscribing, and that you're here, like, following, and sharing, mashing all the buttons so you get all the MotoGP stuff we do here. Thank you again so much for joining me. And now we're going to talk to the chat and just BS on some MotoGP stuff. And until next week, thank you so much.